Hi again, everyone, and welcome back to Enjoy English School. I'm Bruce.
大家好，我是 Bernice.
Today and tomorrow, we are going to be teaching you from our features category in your magazine. A feature is to make something that is not well known. You're going to focus on something that most people wouldn't realize or have even heard about.
对，所以我们今天呢要讲的这个主题呢是讲到专题特写，就像老师刚才讲的啦，专题特写的这个主要它的目的就是让一些可能我们不是非常听过或看过的东西，把它变成大家都知道了。
Vintage fashion is what we will be talking about. Fashion, you know. I know you know the word fashion. Vintage means from the past, lasting a long time, and being of high quality.
所以我们要讨论的呢是复古的时尚。那就像老师讲的 fashion 大家都知道这些流行的东西。那这个 vintage 的意思就是说它曾经在过去好的这个时期里面是当时很棒的很经典的东西，然后我们要来讨论一下。
Okay, so when now that we're through with this introduction, we're going to take a short break before we start the first paragraph.
Vintage fashion. The fashion industry moves in seasonal cycles, usually defined by collections for spring, summer, and fall-winter. Each year, famous designers create new looks that they hope will be the next big thing. However, there is one stubborn fashion trend that plays on a different timeline. Vintage fashion moves at a much slower pace. The movement began around the time of the First World War due to the lack of clothing fabric. For an item to be considered vintage, it has to be 20 to 100 years old. Anything older than 100 years is called antique. Many clothing companies are now using old patterns and styles to make new clothing, and these imitation items are described as retro. For an item to be truly vintage, it should be representative of a specific trend or style from its era. Some good examples of classic vintage items would be a blazer from the 1980s with shoulder pads, a pair of flowing bell-bottoms from the 1960s, or an oversized sweatshirt from the 1990s. Many young people like to go through the closets of their parents to see if any old items can be brought back in style.
The fashion industry moves in seasonal cycles, usually defined by collections for spring, summer, and fall, winter. If you are a fashion hound, H-O-U-N-D, H-O-U-N-D, which means dog, a fashion hound is someone who is always looking for the latest fashion, particularly in clothing. And if they see something they like, they will buy it and wear it and show it off.
老师刚才讲了一个这个 hound 的这个字，我记得美国有一个 bus 是不是叫 greyhound？
Yeah.
OK， 好，就是狗的意思。好，意思就是说呢，我们一开始的主词要讲的就是这种时尚的这个产业，好 ，fashion industry。这个时尚产业呢，它是会不断的随着什么东西来动呢？它动的这个方式呢，主要是按照 seasonal， 就是季节式的一个 cycle， 一个循环。那基本上呢，通常就是会被这样子的 defined， 好，这边 defined 的意思就是说，把它做一个这个界定，好，把它分一下，分成呢一些的 collections， 就是这样的一些系列，哈，这些系列呢，它分的方式是按照第一个是先 spring summer 是在一起的，就是春夏系列，然后接着下一个系列就是 fall winter， 就是秋冬系列的时尚。
Each year, famous designers create new looks that they hope will be the next big thing. There are some excellent movies about the fashion world, and it is very competitive, very stressful. It causes a lot of pressure on the people who are in it because things have to be done very quickly.
没错。
And you have to arrange TV and radio and newspaper and magazine people to show your products if you're going to be well known and famous.
好，所以他这边就说了，每一年呢，有好多的这些有名的设计师呢，他们当然就是要试着呢，去创造出一些这些新的、不同的 looks 就是他这个样貌，他那个样子。那这些样子呢，就是他们希望呢，会是怎么样呢？Be the next big thing， 就是指哇，接下来就是成为他们大红大紫，能让他们这个作品创作能够让世人所知道的这样的一个样子。就像老师刚才讲的，时尚业非常的竞争，非常的速度，非常的快速啊，他换的那一些他的样式是很快的，所以你要他们让这个东西成为大家所众所周知的，这对他们来说确实是 big
thing。However,there is one stubborn fashion trend that plays on a different timeline. Timeline, we just talked about the seasonal spring, summer, or fall, winter. That is one kind of timeline, but vintage fashion is not. So they call it a stubborn fashion. It's going to do what it wants to do, and it doesn't care what anybody else does if you are stubborn.
对，所以他说，可是然而呢，有一种呢，就是像这种 vintage fashion 一样，它非常的 stubborn， 就是它非常的倔强，就像老师刚才讲了，他管别人是什么样的一个状况，我做我自己的，对不对？所以他呢，他的 trend， 他这个潮流呢，基本上呢，就是用一种不同的时间线去让它发光发热。它不是说我一定要按照春夏秋冬这样子，我有我自己的时间线，所以才说它非常的 stubborn。
Okay, that's a good introduction. We'll take a short break and fill you in on more. Okay, now let's continue in the second paragraph. Vintage fashion moves at a much slower pace. In the first paragraph, we just learned you have the spring, summer, fall, winter, and when the fall, winter clothes come out, available to buy at department stores and so on, those people are already working on the spring, summer for the next year. So there's lots of pressure, and their time cycle is very specific. But vintage fashion doesn't worry about the spring, summer, or what season it is because they're thinking in a much longer timeline.
所以这边就讲到了，刚才就说了，他非常的 stubborn 啊，他非常的倔强的，他不是他管你这个速度是怎么样变化多快，对不对？他不是这个所谓的复古时尚呢，他们的这个步调啊是非常慢的 ，much slower， 就是比跟其他的这些所谓的春夏秋冬这样的一个比较呢，它是慢多了。这边的 pace 就是讲它的这个步调是慢很多的。
The movement began around the time of the First World War due to the lack of clothing fabric. Now, the movement here is talking about the vintage fashion idea. It began around the time of the First World War, about 1916 to about 1919. 左右. That was World War I. And many people wore the same clothing because it was a world war, or the same kind of clothing, but there was a lack of clothing fabric. There were a lack of many things because of the war. So if you had clothing, maybe thick clothing, you wore the same thing all winter. People didn't have as much money in the past as we do now.
没错，所以这边就讲说，它这样的一个运动，这个运动就是讲的刚才这个复古这样的一个时尚的运动，它开始的时间点呢，大约就是在第一次世界大战的时候。那为什么会在这个时间点开始 ？Due to 就是 because of 当时呢 lack 就是缺乏，因为在战时嘛，战争的时候哪有那么多钱跟时间去想我今天要穿什么，明天穿什么，所以就像老师刚刚讲，可能冬天你穿了一个外套，就是一整个冬天你就穿那个外套，所以呢当时也缺乏了所谓的 clothing， 就是衣服的这样的一个布料。Fabric 就是它的布料，所以因为缺乏布料，所以其实也没有什么衣服可以选择。
For an item to be considered vintage, it has to be 20 to 100 years old. In the modern fashion world, if someone says, oh, there's a vintage fashion, maybe they're thinking of World War II at that time. What were people wearing at that time? Or even earlier?Maybe in the 1930s, with the clubs and jazz just coming into fashion in music, people were changing their clothing fashion as well.
好，接着他就说了，因为呢，他这个 for an item， 就是说，如果你要把这个 item 这样的一个物件呢，这样的一个物品，你如果要说 be considered， 就是被认为哈，大家认为说，你这个物品这个物件就是 vintage， 就是复古的意思的话呢，至少你这个玩意儿呢要20到100岁。好，就是有20到100年的历史，就是我看到这个 item， 我就会想到它是在哪一个时期，当时的这个状态的底下，人们穿的这样的一个衣服。
When I was in my teenage years to about 20, I wore my grandfather's World War I Army jacket. Excellent condition, pure wool, very well made.That was a vintage look.
所以以前那个 Bruce 老师他小的时候有穿过他的这个曾祖父的这个第一次世界大战的衣服，哈，他认为材质非常的不错。
Cool. Okay, anything older than 100 years is called antique. So we have modern and now looks. We have vintage looks. There are also antique looks, but those are 100 years old or older.
所以如果呢你有超过100年的历史的东西呢，我们有另外一个称呼，我们讲称呼为古董级的。
Many clothing companies are now using old patterns and styles to make new clothing, and these imitation items are described as retro. So now we have another fashion term for you. But let's look at these words first. Patterns and styles. Pattern is a design. I have stripes on my shirt. That's a kind of pattern. Or a woman may have little flowers on a blouse. Anything that is put onto a pure color or pure service can be called a pattern. Style is another word for fashion. The length of skirts, for example, for women, they go up, they go down over time. So this, I don't know what the style now is, but around World War II, your grandfather's time, a woman wore very long skirts, almost like dresses.
好，所以接下来他就讲了，有许多的这一些服饰的这些公司呢，他们现在都会使用一些比较旧款的一些这个 patterns。刚刚老师讲了，就是你在这个衣服的表面上面的，比如说老师的是条纹的，我的是花状的这样的就是一种 pattern。然后 style 就是它的一个款式，比如说像老师刚才描述裙子的长啊、短啊，或者是各式各样不同的衣服设计出来的那个样式。好，那这些呢，很多的这些服饰公司就会用这些比较之前的旧的这些样的版本呢，来制作一些他们现在新的一些衣服。而且呢，这些东西我们就称之为 imitation items， 就是他们是所谓的模仿的，就是去 copy 出来的，模仿它的东西。那我们就把它描述成为另外一个字，叫做仿古类的。
Now, retro, I'll give you a good example of this. In the 1940s and 50s, young men had to wear leather jacket, black leather jacket. But after the hippies, 1960s, 1970s, it wasn't popular anymore. Now, in some countries, the black jacket is back. And then we call it a retro style.
所以老师在解释这个 retro 这个意思，就是说在之前的时候，他们那个时候他们嬉皮族的要穿那个黑色的皮的这个外套，然后后来到现在又有这样的一个皮衣出现了，就黑的皮又回归了。那这样的一个物件，我们就称之为它是仿古的。
Okay, let's take another short break and we'll finish up with our final paragraph for today's lesson.
Okay.
Oh, welcome back. Now, in this paragraph, we continue an idea from our last one about retro and vintage. For an item to be truly vintage, it should be representative of a specific trend or style from its era. We can say era, we can also say era. 都可以. And I think the black leather jacket for men is a good example. Today it's not popular. I don't see young men wearing a black leather jacket. But in the 1950s, anyone who could afford it, any young man who could afford it, think of Elvis Presley, if you know who he was, always in a black leather jacket. It was just considered so cool that everybody wanted to do it.
老师刚刚举例就是猫王，然后他会有抖脚的动作。OK， 他们那个年代的人就是穿老师刚才讲的黑的这个皮夹克，好这样子。好，他说呢，如果呢你要把一个 item 一样东西，你真的是它要 truly 它真正表现出它的 vintage 复古的那个样子呢，基本上呢它必须就是要有代表，好 be representative of 就是你要有这样的一种代表性，它主要就是要代表一种比较特定的一种趋势。或者是一个 style， 或者是一个它的这个风格，然后要从那个时候的年代，所以刚刚老师讲说，你可以念 era 或者是 era 这个字，这个字呢就是表示这个特殊事件所发生的一个特别的年代，所以你要因为这样的一个年代，然后很特定的年代，然后你去作为它的一个代表的一个趋势跟风格性，那么这样的东西就是说，我们说，是真的是在表现那个时候的复古。
Some good examples of classic vintage items. I gave you one, the black leather jacket. Here are some others. Would be a blazer from the 1980s. A blazer is a kind of men's top, a jacket. Not a leather jacket, but a dress jacket from the 1980s with shoulder pads, thick pieces of material to help a man look bigger and stronger, I guess. A pair of flowing bell bottoms. Now, this was hippies from the 1960s. They're pants, but at the bottom, before the foot, they flare out like this. So when you're walking, it was a great feeling to wear those back in the day. Or an oversized sweatshirt from the 1990s. That's not that long ago. People would go to parties with a big sweatshirt. We consider that casual, C-A-S-U-A-L. C-A-S-U-A-L. That's the opposite of formal. If I wear a suit, that's formal clothing. A sweatshirt or a pair of pants that have holes in them. And the first time I said that, I said, oh, that poor girl.
不是 That's why they say fashion. 好，所以老师刚刚的意思是说，他看到那个裤子上面有洞，有没有？他说：“哦，你好穷哦，怎么那么可怜，穿破洞的衣服？不对，那个就是流行嘛，破越多洞越流行，对不对？好，所以呢，这边就是讲到说，他给你了一些不错的这些例子，就是什么叫复古的一些东西哈。比如说呢，第一个像刚才 Bruce 老师讲的，黑色的那个皮夹克，这是其中一个。那其他的呢，还有就是在1980年代那个时候，男生要穿的那种 很正式的西装的一个外套。那这个外套它一定旁边呢，就是你的肩膀上面要有垫这个东西，垫肩的东西，就是让男人看起来很挺、很壮、很高那个感觉哈。这是第一个，然后再来呢，就是1960年代那个时候流行的喇叭裤。那因为你的裤管有2个哈，所以你要记得你要用 a pair of 这样子哈。那为什么用 flowing？ 因为就像老师刚才讲，它到那个裤脚的地方，它会往外这样子比较扩宽一点点哈，所以它是一个 bell bottoms， 就是它的下面像一个铃，对，一个喇叭铃铛下面的这样一个形状。然后再来的是 oversized， 就是很大一件。比如说可能我大概是穿 L 号的，那可能我就穿一个这个叫什么 XXL， 好，这样子那就是 oversized 的，好，这样的一个 sweatshirt。那刚才我们讲的 sweatshirt 就是比较 casual， 就是比较轻松休闲的一些服装，刚好跟 formal 就是正式的服装是一个相反的字。那个时候的年代是1990年代，所以这些的风格呢都是一种复古的一个风格。
Let's finish up today's material. Many young people like to go through the closets of their parents to see if any old items can be brought back in style. For example, 1990s, 1960s, there's still clothing around, but they're in old people's closets. But young people might think, wow, look at this, and wear it as a kind of an old fashion to become a new fashion.
对，所以呢，这些年轻人要怎么样让这些 old fashion 变成 new fashion 呢？就只好去父母亲的衣柜里面去找一找。好，所以去 go through 的意思就是翻来翻去，翻翻看爸爸妈妈的这个衣柜里面呢，是不是有任何一件这个所谓的 vintage items 可以让他们这些 old items 可以呢brought back， 就是被带回来，意思就是重返流行的意思，而且特别是 in style 的这个老的衣物，所以就是去父母或者是 grandparents 的那个衣柜里面找找看吧，或许你可以找到几件这个重返流行的老衣物哦。
Okay, that's for today's material. Remember, this is a 2-day lesson. We're going to take a short break and review some of the important vocabulary items from today's lesson.
好的。
Okay, our first vocabulary item for review is the word collection, which has different meanings. Basically, it's a grouping of similar things. You collect stamps, you collect coins, you collect shoes, something like that. But a collection, as we use it here, is in the clothing industry. Maybe a spring-summer collection will be a particular group of clothing from one designer for one period of time.
所以这边的字，这个字当名词，原本像老师刚刚讲的是收集品，比如说你收集这个邮票或者是什么东西。那在这儿呢，我们用在这个时尚产业的意思，就是指比如说春夏秋冬他们某一个时段的一个系列的产品，这时候我们就用到 collection。Okay,
our second item is stubborn, and that means I'm not going to listen to anybody else. I have my own way to do things. I'm not going to do what you want me to do.
没错，这个字当形容词就是很倔强、很固执的意思。
Number 3, at a blank pace. Now, pace is the key word. It means speed, but it could be at a slow pace, so your speed is slow.
对，所以 pace 这个字就是速度、步调的意思，所以你可能快啊，可能慢。介系词我们都是用 at。Our
next item, pattern, as we mentioned earlier, is a design.
就是一个东西的设计的样式图案。
The next, number 5, be described as, is how something is talked about or written about.
对，所以本来 describe 就是描述的意思，所以我们可以把它翻译成被描述为什么样子，或者是把被这个说明、解释或界定为什么样子。
Number 6, representative means something is a good example or sample. In fashion, it would be a type of clothing or a period of time.
没错，就是代表性的。
If you go through something, you Look very carefully for specific things.
就是你去找东西，但是你很仔细的去翻找。
And our last item, in style, out of style.
好，就是像以 Bruce 老师这个就是非常流行的时尚，我呢就是退流行啦。哎呀，好的，所以是一个是 in， 一个是 out of。
Okay, that's it for today's lesson. But remember, tomorrow we'll be back with more about fashion.
Fashion.